Hello, and welcome to Writer's Revenge, a web series designed to make you a better writer. My name is Mark Major. I'm a graduate of the University of Wisconsin-Madison's Writing Department, and I'm also your humble instructor for the series. Welcome to the second episode of Writer's Revenge. In this episode, I am going to take you through the transitional arc of a narrative, of a story. And as all my episodes, I like to split them up into three different sections. And the first section, I'm just going to walk you through, or essentially I'm going to explain to you the three acts and the traditional way of creating a narrative. And then in the second part, I'm going to actually walk you through beat by beat what needs to happen at every step along the way of the narrative. And then finally, we're going to go over some sort of broad general examples of how the three-act transitional arc plays out in some different genres. And after this episode, I think you're going to have a real strong grounding for where to begin when you sit down and you're like, okay, I'm going to write a story. Where do I start? Let's talk a little bit about the three acts that make up a narrative transitional arc. And when I say transitional arc, essentially what we have is a protagonist. They're trapped in whatever their life is until something comes along and happens to them. And then they have what is known as a call to action. They react, they go on a type of adventure, and at the end of it, they come out a better person. And we sort of become better people vicariously through watching or reading other people's stories that go through this transition. So the way we break up a story then is we break them up into the first, second, and third act. Okay, the first act is always what is referred to as an up act, in that there's a spot that we start at that is pretty high up. We're always like in a city that is working. We're always in a society that is running. We're always showing you day-to-day life, and things are good or things are as they should be. The second act is always a down act, and you need to remember that the second act is when things are at their worst. And much of the narrative is to set someone up in the first act so that they can fall far in the second act. You need to actually take the story down to a sort of miserable moment. Then the third act is an up act again, and it's where we bounce back and we rise up, and eventually it keeps rising, the story, until it climaxes, which is essentially the end of the story. After the climax, it abruptly comes down and it flatlines out a little bit. After the climax, the peak of a story, there's not much more being told. It's kind of over. At that point, you're taking the last remaining cue balls that are on the board and you're just kind of slowly pushing them in the pockets. One or two here, there. We're just slowly pushing them. That's the way it goes. So there are only three acts to a narrative. There isn't two acts, right? You might think there's a first half and a second half. What you would find is that the end of Act 1 and the beginning of Act 2, essentially in a two-act thing, really makes a middle act. You're always going to have three acts because you're always going to have the second act be a down act. It's going to be a downer. It's where the things are at their worst. And that's always in the middle of the story. And so if you've been out there thinking, I want to become a writer, but where do I start? How do I sit down and start typing? Well, you need to plot out your story in these three acts. And you have to take into account that the second act is a down act. Now, some people will claim that there could be 4 acts, that after 3 acts you could have a 4th act. I could cite maybe one example of a particularly well-known work, and that would be Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. When the story concludes at its peak with the Ring of Power going into Mount Doom, it's essentially over at that point. It's just a matter of wrapping up everybody's feelings at the ending and seeing who survives the battle, what kind of condition everybody's in. Now, there is another little story that pops up at the end of that book where the hobbits return back home and they find out that some evil has gotten into the Shire while they're gone and they have to take care of it. That is a mini story stapled onto the end with its own 1, 2, 3 acts into it. It is not a 4th act. Now, somebody could claim that a 4th act might be something like in a Marvel movie, those extra scenes that they put in. And what I mean by that is it's really more of a metaphorical 4th act, kind of like the 19th hole in golf, right? There's only 18 holes in golf. The 19th hole is the nickname for when you go sit at the bar and drink after playing 18 rounds of golf. Golf, by the way, is an excuse for people to drink. If you didn't know that, at least you're going to come away with that bit of knowledge from the series. So there are only 3 acts. There are not 2 acts. There are not 4 acts. It doesn't make sense to have 1 act. Something has to happen. And if you think about it, it's kind of like a knock-knock joke. It's a call, a response, and a punchline. And that's what you as a writer need to be setting up. Let's walk through all the different beats that happen within each of the 3 acts. And I think after this, you're going to have a pretty good, firm planting of how to sit down and just sort of on a single piece of paper, plot out your story as far as what you're going to write. Now, that doesn't mean that you're stuck with that plan. If during the course of writing, you need to change things to make it work, you will change things to make it work. However, this is the plan that everybody follows, and this is the plan that essentially works, and this is the plan that you're ultimately going to be using. In the first act, we almost always, in fact, I don't want to say almost always, we always start off with a battle. Now, if it's a war story, it's an actual battle. Like, think of the first Star Wars movie, right? It has war in the title, and it opens with a battle out in space, okay? Doesn't specifically open with it. It actually opens with space and a bunch of words crawling, and then the camera kind of tilts down, and then a battle begins. So it's not exactly 100% out of the gate, but as close as they could get it, it opens with a battle, and most stories do. Now, you go, well, Shakespeare, is that? I don't remember those opening with a battle. Well, think about Romeo and Juliet, right? Isn't it 2 families who are fighting, the Hatfields and the McCoys? Or it opens with a battle. Everything opens with a battle. Now, if you're doing a story that doesn't have an actual war going on it so that you wouldn't have a literal battle, well, then you have a metaphorical battle. You have some type of action that's going on. It could be a husband and a wife that are fighting and they're like yelling and throwing things and things are breaking. It could be a car chase. It could be some type of breaking in, some type of an act of a cat burglary or something. It has to be some type of an action that equates itself to being a battle, something to draw people in. You don't just start rolling out, introducing characters and characters and characters. You need to start with an action. You need to start with a battle. After the battle is really when you start to introduce your main character, and you introduce them in your routine. What you want to set up here is you want to, with the least amount of work and the most amount of efficiency, demonstrate the daily routine that the character is going through, so that they see exactly this is what they do over and over and over again. And you need to convey that is what this figure is about, that is what this character is about. That's who this person is. Again, if we go back to the Star Wars analogy, because everyone's seen it, you know what I'm talking about. We open with a battle, and then we finally introduce our main character, Luke Skywalker, and we see him doing business as usual. He's kicking it with his aunt and uncle. They're having, sort of like disputes as to what Luke wants to do with his time, and he's a kid on a farm, all that kind of stuff. It's conveyed rather quickly that this is just like every day for Luke Skywalker, okay? The next beat in our story is something changes. It's the day that something different happens. It's the day where you're expecting something and it's not there, or something shows up that you weren't expecting. Something changes, something out of the ordinary, something peculiar. It can be a massive shift or it can be a slight shift. That's up to the person telling the story. That's not baked into this, but something within the routine needs to change. That is a big part of this next beat. And that is much of what the first act is about. The next beat, before we end the first act, is we take the character and we show them follow the new course that they have to take as a result of the change. So if they were expecting something and it didn't show up, all of a sudden they have some type of a reaction that causes them to do something, to go somewhere, to say something, to start a type of adventure. This is not quite the call to action. This is a reaction to the change in the environment, but this is all part of the first act. And so this is what you're going to be concentrating on. You show a routine, you show how it changes, you follow that person. Now, we may follow that person a long ways. We might follow that person a short ways. That's not what this is about. This is about telling you, make a character, show a routine, show the day something changes, and then follow where that person goes. We are getting now onto the second act, and the second act is kind of like the first act in that it usually opens with a battle, or sometimes the first act ends with a battle. And again, when I say battle, it could be a literal battle, or it could be a metaphorical battle. It could be some type of a challenge, some type of an action. I don't want you to get fixated on the word battle. I want you to get fixated on the fact that something needs to happen there that gives us a type of a closing of a curtain or the opening of a curtain. And a battle is almost always it. So I like to say that the battle closes out the first act. It gives us a punctuation, and that allows a bit of quietness on the battlefield to open up on the second act after this big, huge battles happen, but it doesn't have to be exactly that way. It could actually just open with the battle, but it's going to come right there in the beats. So whether you want to call that part of the first or part of the second act, that's up to you. All that I'm saying is it needs to happen. We are now in the second act, and this is the part where things go from better to bad to worse. Here's where you show the descent of a character. This is where you bring the person down, or the adventure that they're on goes down. They continue to spiral down. Things continue to get worse. This is part of the redemption of the character that you're doing at the end, is to take the person down as far as you can go. Now, if you can take a character down really far and rebound them really high, I believe, non-ironically, that the term for that would be epic, okay? Just to give you an idea. Do you need to make everything epic? No. Can you make these sort of troughs and peaks, can you make them soft? Yeah, certainly. Certainly you can. But you have to acknowledge the dynamics. You need to take the character down, and that is what the second act is about. In fact, the second act, when it gets to the very bottom, it's when things are at their worst. Here is the next beat that we're going to be looking for. This is the part where somebody or something has to die. There always needs to be a loss in the second act. And a lot of times that could be the old wise teacher, the old man, the old woman, the general, the president who is leading, the king who is leading, sort of what represents the old world or a tie to the old world a familiar character. It could also be something very cherished to the character. Maybe the character is somebody who has gotten really far in life because they have a particularly awesome automobile. They have a really great car and allows them to win a bunch of races or something, and they make a bunch of money. And then in the second act, the car gets destroyed. You have to take something special away from the main character in the second act. And that's part of bringing things down to their worst. Somebody needs to be sacrificed. Somebody needs to go in the second act, and usually it's the remains of the old guard. It's the old wisdom, the old teacher, the person that really helped the character get this far in the story. This is where they're out. Now, do they have to actually die? Not specifically. It could be somebody who has a heart attack and they go to the hospital and they're sort of, taken out of the game. Still alive, but they're, now sort of removed from the day-to-day, as it were. And that person may eventually pass away at the end. You may decide that, okay, they're not dead second act, but by the third act, this person will have passed away. That's really where this is going, and that you need to essentially pick the important thing to the character that needs to be sacrificed. And most of the time, it's a person, and it's a person who's close. It's a person who's cherished. It's usually a person who is older. All right, again, we're always using battles to open and close our curtains. It's a great way. And we are at the third act at this point. Now, at this point, after the death of a loved one in the second act, the main character at this point will have had the awakening. And this is where the person decides to armor up and go back and challenge. And so this comes down to a type of a really simple fight where the first act, someone throws a punch at you. The second act, you fall down. The third act, you get back up and you punch them and you knock them out. It's really that simple. And so the third act is going to be about punching back and bringing the character back over the obstacles that they were faced with and have them re-meet their challenges. They have to have learned something that now allows them to overcome the thing that got them into the second act. This is really the most important part, is this is where you demonstrate how this new wisdom, this new zest for life is going to make this character able to defeat the thing that got them in the predicament that they're in. And this is where we now follow my graph that will take us to this climax. And what you need to do is you need to have this sort of one final battle, right? And I like the idea of having one per act. But this one final battle for this person to fight, to overcome one final action, and it's usually the big one. It usually ends with some sort of dramatic peak, something very unique to the character that the character can do. It's something that rewards the person, but everyone in the community benefits from this person's action. If you look at, again, our classic movie that I lean on for writing, if you look at Star Wars 77, of course, it's where Luke Skywalker manages to blow up the Death Star. That's basically the peak of the movie. After this point, you can get up out of your chair and you can go home. There's still some more movie to go, but you don't really need to see it. And it's not very long, and it's not much information in it. And this is essentially after the peak where the climactic battle, this is basically the end of your story, with one last beat being the wrap-up. What I described is like after the pool game's over and there's a couple balls still on the table and you just kind of take those and you just sort of push them in the pockets. That's what this is. And you do need to add that in there. You do need to write that. There's nothing wrong with writing that. And there's nothing wrong with putting important information in that spot for the reader. You don't have to totally bag on that and think it's not important. However, please know that audiences will leave the seat once they see the climax fully fulfilled. They may not stick around till the end. If you're waiting for that last part, the wrap-up, to put your message in, you might want to reconsider. That is a bit of a side note, and it only goes to tell you that you have to cater to the audience. Let me wrap up here with a third part where we just talk about how the three acts are used in different types of storytelling. If you apply the three acts to, say, something like fantasy, what you're going to get is the first act, it's summer. People are happy, it's warm, they have plenty of resources, of food, everything is going along as normal. And then what happens? Well, the days start getting shorter and it starts turning to winter. All of a sudden, we have a goblin army on the march. This is when the enemies of man come out. This is when they lead their attack. And during winter and our second act, this is when the king is going to die. But after the king dies, the prince, who has been sort of in the king's shadow all these years, realizes that it's time for him to awaken. And he needs to go out and he needs to lead his people against this goblin army, take back the lands. That is what spring is. Spring is this regrowth and the return of the prince who is now our new king. And so if you think about summer, winter, spring in terms of the three acts, it really makes a lot of sense, and it really makes it kind of easy, almost to the point of being dumb. It's pretty tough now at this point if you can't write a story that goes through summer, winter, and spring and sort of hits all the notes that you get from the seasons themselves. Well, then you're going to have a really tough time, because it's about the easiest thing you can do, and it's about the most difficult thing you can do, because it's really what you need to be doing. It's really the formula, and it's really the best way to go. This has been Writer's Revenge, educational series designed to make you a better writer. New episodes come out every Wednesday on this channel. Thanks for sticking around. I'll see you guys in the next episode.